The Illinois House passed changes to public employee pensions, but there's more to the story. We'll tell you next on Capitol View. Good evening and welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, glad to see you.
Nice to be here.
And Chris Wetterich, Editor of the Editorial Page at the SJR. Chris, glad you're here.
Good to be here, Jamie.
So we've been doing a lot of talking about pensions in the House. A lot of amendments have come up for floor votes, but not actually come up for a final vote to be passed into the Senate. Today, we saw a couple of bills that the House voted on and passed over to the other chamber. Chris, this seems like kind of a huge deal, but can you put it in context for us?
Yeah, basically what they're doing in the House is kind of a piecemeal assembly of a bill, and I'm not quite sure what the end game is. I don't think anybody knows except for Speaker Madigan. Today, before we taped this program, they passed two parts to pension reform and sent them to the Senate. One bill would cap the amount of money that a pension can be based on at the same level that Social Security is based on. So, everybody who gets a state pension would be limited in the amount of money that their pension could be based on. And then the other amendment, or the other bill, changed the retirement age on a kind of a sliding scale. So, for example, everybody over the age of, I believe, 45 would not face a change in their retirement age, but anybody younger than that on a sliding scale would see their retirement age that they're eligible to retire with go up. So those two passed the House today and now head to the Senate, where their fate is uncertain. Basically, you have two different processes going on here. In the House, there maybe even three if you really think about it. In the House, they're kind of assembling a bill on the floor, taking various ideas that have been out there and voting on them. They're also doing a bill in the House committees sponsored by Representative Elaine Neckritz and House Minority Leader Tom Cross. And then in the Senate, they have the same kind of Cross-Neckritz bill sponsored by Senator Daniel Biss, and then John Cullerton has his own Senate bill. So you have a lot of moving parts with this pension issue, and nobody's quite sure what's going to end up on the governor's desk, if anything.
And just to take a step back and put it even maybe a little bit more in context, this is the first time we've seen the House approve anything that applies to all the pension systems except for the judges.
Right.
But Chris, this doesn't mean that these are the changes that are coming anytime soon, right?
I don't think so. I feel like these are test votes. These are votes to see where members stand, how many votes they can attract for certain aspects of it. That's seems to be what's going on. Now, with Mike Madigan, there's always a greater plan that is kind of in his head and his staff members' heads, and we're not privy to it. And most lawmakers aren't privy to it either. So we'll see how this fits in, I think, as the spring goes on. But for now, we have a bunch of moving parts to it, and we're not anywhere near the finish line, I don't think.
Well, and these two components are part of that overall bill that's being sponsored by Representative Neckritz and House Minority Leader Cross. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about that plan, and what's the significance that the House did sign off on two components of that?
Well, I tend to agree with what Chris said. I think he's right on the money. These are test votes to see who's where, to try and get a feel for the lay of the land. And I think it's quite conceivable that the Senate would ignore what the House did and move forward with its own plan and then see how the House reacts to that. I think it's very much in flux. And to me, the bottom line question is, what is the real purpose behind doing this? And the reason I say that is, to me, and I'm not a lawyer, and I suppose I should mention at this point, I also have, I guess, a vested interest in that. I'm a member of the State University's retirement system. I'm vested. So should I ever decide to retire, I could actually collect a pension, I suppose. But to me, none of this stuff looks constitutional. The Constitution says that membership in a public employee retirement system is a contractual relationship, that the benefits of it cannot be diminished or impaired. All the legislation we're talking about so far would diminish benefits. Now, Senator Cullerton's proposal would say, well, I agree that I can't take your pension benefits away unilaterally, Wheeler, but if you decide, I'm willing to give them up, that's okay. And in return for giving them up, I will offer you something else. And in Cullerton's case, the something else is state healthcare insurance. And the option would be you keep your current pension with all the perks and the cost of living adjustments and everything else, but you forego state subsidized health insurance for the rest of your life. Or you accept reduced benefits, smaller COLA, but you still have access to the health insurance program. And I guess in Senator Cullerton's mind, this is the kind of choice that would mean you're freely giving up your benefits. It's not being forced upon you. But on the other hand, it reminds me of the choice that when you're walking down the dark alley and the guy puts the gun in your ribs and says, your money or your life, that's the kind of choice it is. It's a choice between the lesser of two evils, I would say. So I'm not sure that would pass constitutional muster either. So I'm really not sure what's going on, because I think all of this stuff has clear constitutional questions.
If I could offer
Yeah.
an opinion here, I guess that's kind of my job. I think Charlie's, and Senator Cullerton will admit to you, this is a coercive choice. We are making it very difficult for anybody to take their COLA who's probably younger than 40, 45, 50. I mean, that's clearly, the intention there. I think there's a degree of constitutionality, and I know that sounds kind of like saying you're kind of pregnant, but but I think that Cullerton's bill probably comes the closest. His legal counsel, Eric Madeir, has studied the issue, pretty in depth. I don't know that they've nailed it. I don't know that they've nailed the constitutional question, but I think the thing that sticks out to me about the legal aspect of this is when Madeir wrote this long research paper, he went back to the Constitutional Convention, and he looked at the debates between the members of the convention. And there were the questions were exactly what people are asking today. Well, can't we kind of get out of this later on if we have a financial crisis? And the answer from the sponsor of the Pension Protection Clause was no. No, this is intended to protect you. Once you start work with the state, these are your benefits, and they will be your benefits going forward. It was very, very clear in the Constitutional Convention. And the Supreme Court, when they decide this issue, they will have to go back, and well, they should. I don't know if they will, but most of the time the court would go back and look and say, well, what's the meaning of this? What did they mean when they wrote this? And it's all clear as day. It's all, there's records, transcripts of these debates. They kept them for a reason. So I think they're going to have a very difficult time in court with either plan, but on the, in terms of degrees of constitutionality, Cullerton probably comes the closest. Necret's Cross is the most politically palatable one because they've thrown in elements that all the various factions from the conservative Illinois Policy Institute to the union side, which wants an ironclad guarantee going forward that the pensions will be funded. So they've mixed all of these ideas into this bill, and it's a great political bill, but as far as constitutionality, I don't think it passes muster.
Yeah, and one of the arguments that's being made that, well, the court will find it constitutional because we're in a dire emergency. And so they'll kind of wink and nod. Yeah, right. The Constitution says this, but times are so tough we have no choice. And I think that's total malarkey. There are other proposals out there that haven't been embodied in bill form to re-amortize the debt, for example. Instead of being on this steeply rising ramp of increased payments every year under 1995 law, let's go back and rejigger it to make it less burdensome. And that hasn't been offered anywhere. And one of the arguments is, well, the national accounting standards and the bond houses want us to get to 100% funding in 30 years.
They're afraid of Wall Street. That's what, yeah. That's why they won't do it.
And the only thing that stops us from doing that is the fact that we actually have to pay these benefits. If we could eliminate the benefits entirely, guess what? We'd be 100% funded today. But it's an emergency. And I can't see the justices saying, well, yeah, it's an emergency. You have no choice. We'll violate the Constitution because of these relatively arbitrary non-binding standards that some national board has set up, or because of what Wall Street wants, particularly when you look at the alternatives. You could re-amortize, no question about its legality. You could say Illinois has, if not the lowest, one of the lowest income tax rates anywhere, and it's a flat tax, and we don't tax retirement income. There's room for revenue growth. We don't tax the same services as all our neighbors do. We tax fewer services than almost any state in the union. There's room for growth there. I mean, I don't think the court is going to say, because you're in a tough political box and you don't want to do the tough things, for decades you've spent money that should have gone to the pensions, you spent it on other good causes because you didn't have the courage to tell voters you got to pay for what you want. That's not enough excuse to negate what is the clear language of the Constitution. As Chris pointed out, what is the clear intent of the people who proposed and put this language into the Constitution, and by extension of the voters who ratified the Constitution back in 1970. So I don't think that argument's going to fly.
I'm not a lawyer either. I just play one here on television. But
Me too.
the underlying legal theory behind Neckards Cross, this police powers thing that Charlie was just talking about, it's extremely weak.
Well, just for full disclosure, as a university employee, I also potentially could get a pension someday, probably a long, long time from now. But and I've mentioned that before. Just to disclose
I'm
as
eligible
well.
now if I wanted to.
I'm going to get nothing, so
So you're the voice of objectivity, right?
I have a 401k, such as it is.
So Charlie, and this is a really hard thing to predict, but if none of these plans will pass muster, what might we see as an ultimate solution here?
Well, there's a proposal put forward by the Center of Tax and Budget Accountability that's pretty straightforward. It says what you ought to do is re-amortize most of the debt. The debt is now in the neighborhood of $95, $97 billion. The difference between the pension benefits we're promised people and the amount of money that's likely to be there when it's time for them to collect. And what the center is saying is, let's 85% of the liability, or 80% or 90% or whatever. Let's not do 100%. Let's say we'll do 90%, and let's do it over a longer period of time, and let's do it the same way you would buy a home or a car, with the same regular payments to amortize the debt. And they calculate somewhere around $6.9 billion per year would be enough to take care of that. Then add on top what's called the normal cost, the value of the benefits that are earned in a particular year. And for the current year, the value of the benefits is less than $2 billion, right in that neighborhood. So you're looking at a total package. I'm going to cheat because I think I have the numbers right here. For the current fiscal year, if I can find it here, it would be roughly around $8.5 billion. So we'd have to come up with additional money this year. The beauty of this plan, where it adopted, is that within less than 10 years, we'd actually be paying less than we would under the current ramp system, and it would decline over time. And the reason it would decline over time, we'd be paying the same $6.9 billion mortgage payments, so to speak, but the normal costs are going to go down because we changed the retirement system a couple years ago. We now have a tier 2, people who are getting less, working longer, paying more. And as they become more of the population of the retirement universe, and as the tier people like myself become fewer, the normal cost is going to go down. In fact, according to the calculations from the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, the employer's share, the state's share of normal costs for the teachers' retirement system will be zero sometime in 2038. In other words, the payroll deductions from the teachers are going to be more than what the ongoing additional pension costs are each year, assuming we've dealt with the unfunded liability. So I know that sounds very complicated, but the basic thing, it's like when you go out and buy a house. Very few people pay cash for a house unless you're a drug dealer, I guess, or unless you're
or independently wealthy through legitimate
or very
means.
wealthy through legitimate. Yeah, I should say that. But in my case, I'm buying a house. Now, what I owe on that house is more than I make, but I don't have to pay it all at once. I pay so much a month, and I'm going to be doing it for, 10, 15 years, and that's the way most people do it. And that's in essence what the center is arguing, that this $98 billion isn't due all in one lump sum at any point in the future.
And it never will be.
And it never will be, unless, I used to use the line, unless the Mayans were right, but we've got past that. And that, you know, it'd be unless the next asteroid comes a lot closer. So it never will become all due. And so we do have the luxury of doing this over time. And as Chris said, the only problem is we're concerned about the bond houses. And I would argue, if I'm one of these bond rating agencies, I'd sit there and I'd say, okay, legislature's decided to spread this out over 45 years. Well, we wish they do it in 30, but that ain't really realistic. And they're only going to go to 90% instead of 100%. Well, they can't really do 100%. But they do have a plan in place. There's no question about whether it's constitutional or not. It's not going to be challenged in court successfully. So the risk of this coming unraveled isn't really that real. On the other hand, here's this other plan that has what in many people's minds are serious constitutional questions that won't be resolved for several years and may go against our basic preference. So is it better to do something that's sure, even though it isn't everything we want, or to gamble on something that may well come undone and wind up with nothing other than 2 more years of kicking the can down the road?
I think there's a darker possibility too. I mean, I think what Charlie's describing could be a possibility. I think they'll go to court with one of these other bills first, and if they get tossed out, maybe they return to what the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability said. I think there's a darker possibility, though, for at least if you're a public employee. The conservative viewpoint, I think, in this state is that these pensions are unaffordable. We don't have them in the private sector. They should be cut. They feel like the public employees should be treated as private sector employees are treated. I think they might, if this fails in court, and they have this confrontation with the Supreme Court over Neckridge Cross, should that emerge. I think the conservative side of the political debate here will push to see that constitutional provision repealed. And I don't know that they would be successful with a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor, but if one of those things change, maybe they make a push for it. That opens up a kind of a whole nother can of worms under the federal Constitution, I think, as to whether you can retroactively repeal that, and it raises contractual questions as well. But I think that's a real possibility down the road here if you don't get a constitution.
I don't disagree. I get the sense that some of these private sector folks, some of the guys from Chicago with their golden parachutes and their stock bonuses and the rest of the perks that real people can only
dream
hope
about.
For. Yeah. I think they have a real dislike, almost a visceral hatred for people in the public sector. I don't know why, but that's the only thing that strikes me that can motivate them with this attack on public workers. And as I've said on this show before, I'm a lifelong member of the Chicago Newspaper Guild, so I'm a union guy. My father was an organizer for the Guild at the Sun-Times back in the 30s. So I clearly have my genetic bias, you might say. But the argument that, well, we've really stuck it to the private sector employee. So the public sector employee should be facing the same financial difficulties that the corporate elite has imposed on the private sector people. I don't think that that's a decent argument from a moral viewpoint or even from a politically good sense argument.
But we're looking at the really opposite ends of the spectrum here. Chris, what about the legislators and Governor Quinn who are saying we're just trying to make this budget work?
Yeah, I mean, Governor Quinn will sign anything they put on his desk at this point. I mean, he's said as much. I mean, as far as the side of the spectrum, each side of the spectrum goes, I mean, neither side is going to win immediately, that's for sure. I think it's a long game for both of them. I think, when you talk about the union side of it, they do not want to give any benefits back, period. They're willing to raise their contributions, but they basically said, we're not going to give we're not going to reduce our benefits, period. And I think that's because they think they have such a strong legal case. They have no interest in negotiating any of it away.
And that raises another question, too. When Speaker Madigan was talking about the issue the other day, he singled out Ask Me, and it said Henry Bayer for, I guess, criticism that they got to be willing to give. With all due respect to the Speaker, Henry Bayer can't speak for me. He can't speak for you. We're not members of Ask Me. I'm not a member of any public employees union for that matter. He can't speak for all the school teachers, and the teachers' retirement system is the largest component of the 5 public systems covered by the state. They're represented either by the Illinois Education Association or the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and because of the nature of a contractual relationship, I don't think anybody can bargain away my contract rights unless I agree to it.
And that goes to Cullerton's bill. He doesn't depend upon consent from the unions. He depends on individual consent from each member of the retirement system. That's kind of not the beauty of it, but the rationale behind what he's tried to do is that each member makes their own choice, and then we don't have to worry about negotiating with Henry Bayer or Cinda Klickner or whoever else is in charge of a union.
But that's what makes that bill politically difficult as well, right? Because of the uncertainty factor of what people would choose.
Because they're not sure how much it saves really, and some Republicans and many members of the Chicago business community want a chunk of flesh from these public employees, as kind of Charlie was saying. So the fact that it saves maybe $100 billion less, depending on who's doing the estimate, is a club for them to beat it down with, and that's what they've tried to do in the last week.
Well, while we're on the topic of pensions, Illinois got charged with fraud by the SEC, or accused of being fraudulent in the way that it presented the pension system and the funding of the pension system to folks who are buying bonds, who are buying state bonds when the state goes to borrow money. Charlie, this happened under the Blagojevich administration, the span that they're pointing to here. Can you tell us a little bit about this SEC
Yeah, and
case?
basically this is a copy of the order, the cease and desist order that the state agreed to, and it's 11 pages, and the main summary is that in connection with multiple bond offerings raising more than $2.2 billion from 2005 through early 2009, the state of Illinois misled bond investors about the adequacy of its statutory plan to fund its pension obligations and the risk created by the state's underfunding of its pension systems. So basically what it's saying is that in the bond prospectuses, the state didn't tell people who might buy the bonds, hey, guess what, we're really not funding our pensions according to the accepted standards. We have this goofy plan that's going to take us out to 2045 instead of only being 30 years, and we're not going to get to 100% funding, we're only going to be 90% funding, and it's going to require us to keep making year after year after year ginormous increases that are not affordable. And so the state, in essence, said, well, we're not going to admit or deny anything, but we will go along with your order. And to me, the interesting thing was there was really no penalty affixed to the state. We weren't fined. We weren't told we have to do anything other than what we've already done. And this all occurred, as you mentioned, under Rod Blagojevich. Changes were made when Quinn came into office to deal with these kinds of issues, and so now the SEC is okay with us. And we're the second state to have this happen to it. New Jersey had it too, and I assume other states are worrying because we didn't do anything different than they did. But I might point out that it's kind of disingenuous for the SEC to say, or suggest investors really didn't know about Illinois' problems. I mean, at the time that Rod Blagojevich unveiled his first budget, his budget director, John Filan, complained about this 1995 law and how it had these unreasonable expectations for increases each year that's threatening everything else. And that was one of their arguments that you used to get support to borrow $10 billion to make the pension payment that year. And as a matter of fact, here's a copy of a report put out by the Economic and Fiscal Commission, the forerunner to the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, from February of 1992, and they talk in there about how the state is underfunding its pensions, and the state's current plan of just paying what was needed to meet the benefits that were being paid in the year is going to lead to problems on down the road and the deterioration of the funding. So it's nothing new, and this is just one I happened to find at random when I was looking for something else,
I was going to ask you how far you dug to find that.
I was looking for something else, and there it was, and I thought, hey, this is cool.
I'll spot you that one. I bet the one in the 50s says the same thing.
So Speaker Madigan has said there really were no victims here. Would you agree with that assessment, Charlie?
Yeah, I don't know. Philosophically, yeah, there was a victim in terms of candidness and openness. On the other hand, as I suggested earlier, the people who really paying attention weren't misled. Now, the victim would be the guy who bought the bonds at a particular rate of interest when, had this been flagged, had there been 24-point bold in the prospectus, oh, by the way, we have this way of funding our pensions that is considered risky, maybe would have been able to get more interest. So there's maybe some interest loss. But in terms of a missed bond payment, no. The last time Illinois missed a bond payment was in 1842. That's more than 170 years ago. So there's really no risk involved here. As a matter of fact, in my mind, a smart investor would say, hey, there's virtually zero risk with Illinois bonds, but because the bond houses dump on them and the SEC now dumped on them, they'll maybe pay me more to borrow my money. And so I'm going to come out ahead. And my guess is the proof will be when we go to market next month with $800 million for a wide variety of capital projects, that offer will be oversubscribed. There'll be more people wanting to borrow or lend us money than we want to borrow.
That's one of the most false narratives out there about the bond rating is that, oh, we won't be able to borrow money. Well, that's, as you said earlier, malarkey. I mean, these guys, this is great because these are safe bonds, but because our bond rating is so bad, they get a great interest rate on it. They're going to see an incredible rate of return compared to other safer bonds. So talk of our bonds being junk or whatever, I think is malarkey.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Charlie and Chris, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.